Thank you so much. And personally, thank you for DataArt for this presentation ability to share with you my knowledge, my experience. So let's start. As mentioned, our topic for the next 45 minutes, less deploy to Azure. So, and as mentioned, feel free to ask any questions related to Azure, and two lucky people can get certificate for AWS. Yeah, it's not a joke, right? Ask question about Azure and let's try Amazon AWS. So before we start, a little background on me. Usually I call myself as engineer, generic engineer with some constraints, where constraints are C# and Microsoft Azure Cloud. I am active Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in developer technologies, and also I'm solution architect at SoftServe INC. I am based in San Francisco, but actually now I am in beautiful Lviv, Ukraine. So if you want to get some more details, feel free to visit my ifesenko.com page. And if you want to download presentation or check out my previous session and recordings, you are more than welcome. So let's talk about our agenda and our deployment. So I think that now in a modern world, everyone has to deploy. You build and you deploy. So, and there is no way how you can avoid this step. And let me start with one funny story, with one issue that my team and I have in the past. So deployment history. I think that you are familiar with Azure Portal, and there is a beautiful page called deployments you can find in your resource group. There is deployments. It's good for troubleshooting to verify how your deployments are going and to find all failures. But there is a cool story before August 6, 2020. There was no automatic deletion. And actually for this deployment page, you have limit for 800 rows, deployments. So it's easily, if you deploy often, and for example, for your dev environment, you deploy several times per day, it's really easy to achieve this limit. And also we faced the same issue 2 years ago with my team, that we tried to deploy, no changes to our deployment scripts, nothing was changed, but we get error, you reach some limit. Limit by CPU or maybe limit by something else. No, it's deployment history limit. And it was so funny because to fix it, we go to our deployments and select our previous deployments and just delete them. So, and it was unexpected a little bit, but a good news that actually in most scenarios, you don't face the situation now, because since August 6, 2020, now Microsoft has fixed this issue and created some background service to automatically delete your old historical deployments. But you can opt out for this feature. It requires some extra work, but you can face this issue if you use some logs on your resource group. And if you have cannot delete log on your resource group, you can face the same situation. So be careful. As I said, in most scenarios, you don't have such situation, but please keep in mind, if you will have something in future, it's possible that you have some lock on your resource group and you face this limit. So let's talk about provisioning of cloud resources. Now we know the deployment history, we have everything, but how to provision, how to do everything in the right way. And first step, if you use right-click and deploy to cloud from your IDE or something from I don't know, from your Visual Studio Code or from your Visual Studio IDE, and you select your resource and say, okay, deploy for me. And if it is not a one-day project, so please don't do this, and don't use this manual click and deploy scenario. Please consider from the beginning infrastructure as a code. It should be your solution by default because it handles a lot of errors and it streamlines your experience. So at the beginning, you think, okay, maybe it's not a good idea. We don't want to waste our time now because our infrastructure is not ready yet. It's not finalized or something like that. No, no, no. It's in the wrong direction. So please start with infrastructure as a code. If it is not your one-day project or even proof of concept for several hours, so please start with infrastructure as a code approach. I think that everyone familiar with infrastructure as a code approach because I think it's default option for now. But I just would like to clarify a few details and make sure we are on the same page. So there are two main approaches: imperative and when we use CLI commands and scripts. For example, for Azure, it may be Azure CLI, and also you can script and use Azure CLI to provision your infrastructure. But I don't think that a good idea because now we have more instruments and we can do much easier for complex scenarios. But still, Azure command line, it's a great tool to get logs or maybe do some modifications, one-time upgrade for your service or something like that. And we have declarative, right? When we have desired state, we have tool and actual resources. It's something like we write our code. So especially for Azure, usually you start with ARM templates. ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. And if I hear ARM templates, I usually ask, okay, do we have senior JSON engineer in our team? And really, it's not a joke because on the picture you can find that you still can do some programming inside your JSON template. But you know that JSON, it's more about schema structure. It's markup, it's not programming language. So, and there is really problem to validate your code, use some highlights, some auto suggestion or something like that. Debugging, it's next to impossible, right? Because to do this debug, and you can see that there is no native model system when you can reuse your previous assets or just remove some code duplication. And that's why I say it's not a joke. You should be a senior JSON engineer to write these ARM templates, run, verify, and it's really a complex solution for now. And Microsoft also recommends to use a new version, let's say ARM templates on the steroids. It's Bicep. Bicep, it's a new tool. Let's say it's more high level language. It's really close to Terraform, but it's by Microsoft. There is no cost, and there's open source, and by the way, built on .NET. And in next release, it will be run on .NET 6. So a lot of benefits from .NET 6 will be incorporated. And you have native model system, so you can reuse, you can organize your infrastructure as a code scripts. In comparison with Terraform, you don't need to use state files to manage your infrastructure, and also tooling experience. It's much better because for IRM templates, usually it starts from nothing. You can do IRM templates and validate all syntax during actual deployment. With Bicep, you have some linters, analyzers, so you can your dev experience is much better. And there is a promise from Microsoft that all new resources from the day one will be supported by Bicep. It is important because if you know and you have the same experience with Terraform or even IRM templates, sometimes we have a new cool Azure service, new resource available, but we cannot create automatically using our infrastructure as a code approach because there is no provider in terms of Terraform or IRM template from Microsoft. We technically we can navigate to create our resource manually and export template, but it's really a complex scenario and it's not the best experience, I would say. So there is a promise from Microsoft that Bicep will support all new resources from day one. Technically, Bicep is still some wrapper under IRM templates, but in future we'll have more flexibility, and for us it will be more easiest way to do. So if you start to do your infrastructure as a code approach, especially for Azure, so please consider Bicep as a first option because there is no extra cost, and sometimes it is important. But personally, I would recommend a lot to take a look to Pulumi because Pulumi, it's your favorite programming language, is a favorite IDE. It's also something like Terraform, but you don't need to know one more language to describe your infrastructure. You can use your favorite C#. You can use all cool features of your language, of your platform. You can easily write your loops, your conditions, use some cool features of syntax sugar from your language. So, and you have IDE support, you can debug your code. So it's really cool. Oh, but it costs, but there is additional cost, but it can simplify and streamline your development. I mean, in terms of describing your infrastructure as a code. And for sure, you can write tests for your infrastructure. It's also a cool feature. So you can run some local tests, you can add policies, you can verify that all policies are met before you run your infrastructure as a code scripts against a real environment. Okay, let's talk about famous containers, because nowadays containers are everywhere. And it's not a bad, it's not a good, but I met some situation when different teams uses containers in not an optimal way, let's say in this scenario, because containers now have multi-stage builds, and it's not something new. It's a really old feature when you can build with one container image and put all artifacts from previous step into a new container, and it makes your image more optimal without any stuff that is not required to run your application. You just need runtime, and that's all. For example, for ASP.NET Core, for to run your application, you can just use ASP semicolon 6.0. There is label, there is a version of your runtime. But to build and run some tests, it's not enough, right? And you need to include SDK. but you don't need to deploy your SDK to your actual server, right? You don't need to use SDK anymore. You just build, you have binaries, and you can wrap them with proper and lightweight image. Okay, maybe you did this step and everything is good. Another situation, when we use Docker as a deployment unit, but still we develop on our local dev boxes. We don't usually use containers for development, for debugging. And there is another issue specifically to .NET runtime. If you use latest version, .NET 6, even .NET 5, technically you are good, but please pay your attention to one point. When you develop on your machine, you have all CPU available, all RAM available on your machine, and everything works fine, works perfectly. Your garbage collector works good. There is no delay. Throughput is good. Everything is good. And when you deploy to container, it means limited. So nature of container is to isolate, right, your application from other components of your guest host system. And also it's isolation in terms of resources. You have limits, and actually your application, your service does not have all CPUs. By default, it might be one CPU or maybe 1.5 CPU and also 2 GB of RAM, something like that. And it affects your runtime. And you might have some different settings for garbage collector. And it was a real problem before. And the Microsoft team did a lot to make sure that if there is some limits in resources, we don't enable server GC mode, and did other optimization. For if you're wondering, you can check link and check if your solution is optimized to be run on containers, because containers, it's about limitation usually, and the runtime behaves differently on your dev boxes and in your container on your production system. But definitely, please use containers, because it's a good deployment unit. You can reuse as artifact. There is, let's say, standard, something like instruction to run your application, and this is good standard and good interface to communicate between different teams with different responsibility. But please don't use containers if you have some simple solution. If you have two services and you deploy them to the same container instance inside Azure, for example, we have ASP.NET Core service, and we have 2 or 3 services, and we deploy to Azure App Service. Azure App Service by itself, it's also some container, some runtime, isolated runtime, and we don't need to wrap in container and put inside other container. We can just build our binaries and say, okay, there is our binaries. Let's put into your runtime, your container. So you don't need to add extra layer, because it's performance. It's no extra power to your deployment. There is no some additional security layers. It just more complexity added to your project, and that's all. It's really from my experience. Now we are talking about some app services, app for containers, and it's also really important to make sure that you deploy your code to the right service in Azure. And I face a different issue when I personally selected wrong service in Azure or even region. And also there's a life hack that if you want to do some cost optimization to save some money, and there is no specific requirement to some Azure region, maybe it's okay to select not in Asia region in UK. You can select somewhere in Europe, for example, right? And it really can save you money because there is difference in price, in cost between different regions for the same service, for the same infrastructure, for the same VM. And in my presentation, there is a link where you can easily compare prices across different regions. So, and you can select, for example, for your production environment, you can go with UK South to be as much as you can close to your end users. But for your dev environment, for your staging environment, or any other environment, you can select other region and deploy to other region just to save money. And if you're selected to use this infrastructure as a code approach, you can easily provision a new environment, a new region in terms of minutes or maybe hours. It depends on the complexity of your solution, of your infrastructure. But really, not everyone knows about a difference in price across different regions in Asia. And also, different cloud providers give us different type of services. So, and specifically, Microsoft Azure does a lot of improvements. I think that maybe you saw Microsoft Ignite conference, and there is a recent announcement about Azure app for containers. There is a specific app that allows you to deploy your containers and take all cool features in terms of auto-scaling from Kubernetes and from Keda. And you don't need to manage this environment. You don't need to think about Kubernetes or Keda environment and how to run and keep up to date this infrastructure, mitigate all security issues, all issues with deployment. You just have Azure app, you have platform as a service where you could just say, okay, this is my container with my worker service, and I want to scale from 0 to 100 instances, depends on messages amount in my RabbitMQ queue. And you can do easily now. You don't need to implement some extra services or spin up entire Kubernetes cluster just to run a few workers. Also, usually operating system is important, but for some simple project, or if you are actually cross-platform, please select Unix operating system by default, because usually it costs less than Windows operating system and it might perform more and for sure it the same level of security, and it's supported by Microsoft Azure. And actually Microsoft Azure did a great job and supports Linux. So it's the same set of services as we can see in Windows App Services, for example. Also, storage account. You can easily change different tiers for your storage account. Please verify if you don't need this data. often you can move your tier storage from hot to cold and also save money. And you can configure this and set up from your infrastructure and modify across all your environments. And also fun stories about Azure, specifically Microsoft, Microsoft Azure, Microsoft App Services. Sometimes you say, okay, you deploy and that's all, and you don't need to restart your service to fix some issues. But it's not true. And sometimes you deploy something new and your app service or other service just does not respond, and you cannot understand why. And usually we start, okay, something wrong in my code, but not always. And actually, it's not true. If you deploy something new to Azure App Service, for example, and it does not respond to you, first thing, please check service health status page. Maybe during this deployment time frame, some outage in your region or maybe across the globe. So maybe it's something global. If service health status page is green, please check Twitter because sometimes for some cloud providers could not show red icons because they were placed in the storage and storage were affected, and so there is a issue to show red light, right? Because storage unavailable, because the issue is storage, and by default there is green light only. And regarding Twitter, it's also not a joke because connected to Microsoft Azure usually to check, okay, Microsoft Azure App Service does not respond. And you can find in tweets that, oh, it doesn't work for me as well. But service health status page shows as everything is okay. And also sometimes Microsoft Azure support answers to our Twitter threads and say, okay, yeah, there is an issue. We are working on it. And I don't know why, but sometimes to check Twitter makes more sense than check service health status page. Also, don't be shy and create a support request, because recently Tim and I faced different issues, and we helped Microsoft dev team to resolve them, because we faced some scenarios when we host under one service plan more than 10 app services actual, and there is some limitation, there is some issue in their code, in their platform, and after deploy our services that don't respond for us, and we couldn't understand why. And we just do restart, redeploy, change app service plan to do actual redeploy of our environment. And it helps, but we wanted to find a root cause of issue. And during support requests and communication with Azure support and with Azure dev team, we help them to fix issue and create some scenarios and alerts for the future issues like that. Or sometimes you just need to rerun. It may be weird in our time when we have a lot of different options, but sometimes it's human error, it's mistake in somewhere, issue somewhere in the code, and we just need to rerun while dev team is working on it. So sometimes Azure team also make some errors, and we can find them using our cloud environment. And also very important topic. And I see that actually teams, not not all teams do monitoring and health setup. Uh, for sure, don't use your index page of your service as a uh, endpoint, health endpoint, just to ping that your application is up and running. Because usually index page it's something more. Just say, okay, my service is okay, and you can do this additional work to your service. Just create a new health endpoint with some simple response. Okay, uh, everything is good. Uh, and next step you can do, okay, let's do more verification. Let's check if database is online and we have connection from our service to database. We can ping other important services, and based on this information, we can return status that everything is okay, or maybe our application is degraded because I don't know, maybe we have thousands messages in queue and we have only one worker and performance is degraded, so we can analyze this response and add extra workers, and we can spin up a new service and make sure that we are performing good. So, and I think that's all what I had to share with you. So thank you so much for your time and attention.